If you had told me at the start of the year that Elderborn would have been one of the best games I'd play in 2020, well, I would have asked you what you've been smoking, and yet here we are in October and that might just be the case. Elderborn is a first-person melee combat game with Souls-like mechanics and a unique sci-fi fantasy theme, and for the last few days I haven't been able to put it down. It's developed by Hyperstrange, who are also working on the upcoming Postal Brain Damaged, and the recently released Crossbow Blood Knight, a Devil Daggers-inspired arena shooter with a dark gothic setting. The latter being a pretty awesome little time sink, which is the most fun I've had with $3, since I stuffed a bunch of dollar bills down the side of your mama's panties. When I first played Elderborn back in January, it had a fair few issues with things like the enemy balancing and also with parrying and blocking during combat. Along with fixing a lot of this stuff throughout the year, Hyperstrange have also added in New Game Plus, along with a permadeath mode for people with watermelon-sized balls. And at this point, it's almost like playing a completely different game and one that I've really enjoyed. At the start of the year, I'd probably still have recommended it just with a dozen or so asterisk points, but now it's an easy sell. So if you've ever wanted a game that feels like a mishmash of Conan the Barbarian, heavy metal, and other violent comic books and cartoons we all probably shouldn't have read as kids, well, this is it. Now, the story as I can understand is that it takes place in a galaxy far, far away, and the setting is an ancient city that was the background for a brutal conflict between warrior tribes. Sometime later, you're now playing as a chosen barbarian sent into the city to uncover its secrets. You've got the option here to play as either a male or a female, and I think you already know what's going to happen here. Look, I'll be real honest with you, Sonny Jim, I like playing video games as a female character. More so when it's the type that looks like they could bend me over their knee and snap me in half like a goddamn matchstick.
No one returned from the pilgrimage, yet there is no fear in my heart.
The female barbarian in this is kinda like a cross between Tana from Heavy Metal and China from WWE. It's a bit of a shame she's got a face like a dropped pie, but her face won't matter all that much anyway when she's sitting on mine. Anyway, simping aside, once you choose the gender of your barbarian, which doesn't seem to affect anything other than the dialogue and the player's character model, you then begin your journey in the recesses of the city catacombs with nothing but an old sword and your reflexes. The game mode's broken up into mainly two locations. You start off in the catacombs beneath the city, and this is a large labyrinth full of traps and hazards that you'll slowly explore and progress through. As you find new weapons, keys, and quest items, you'll unlock new areas along with finding shortcuts to get back to previously explored sections. These undead areas are rife with undead warriors, often attacking you with nothing but their bare hands. Then others might have swords or shields, sickles, and more annoying assholes who hang back and throw spears at you. You see those yellow slugs all over their bodies? Well, in the game's lore, this is responsible for reanimating them, and it also serves as a bit of a pseudo health bar. With every hit they take, a few more slugs are gonna get knocked off them until they'll finally buy the farm. And I think it's a pretty cool way of communicating the condition of an enemy to the player without cluttering the screen up with a needless health bar. Underground, you'll also deal with a few different varieties of scorpions, nasty little bastards that seem to be able to finish you off in a couple of hits, and I've never forgiven these things since I watched Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Finally, before you escape the catacombs, you've got a boss fight against a big-ass warrior named Janus, the guy responsible for this whole mess and the one who's guarding the exit. Think of him as the Hans Gross of the catacombs, and it's along the same line. During this boss fight, this guy's got 3 different phases, with him getting slightly more pissed off at you with each one. After that, you'll find yourself on the surface in the city of Jormum. Wait a minute, Jormum? As in your mum?
Jormum and its golden army was the bane of the realm for ages.
Wow, these jokes write themselves. This is a devastated and crumbling civilization where the evidence of that horrible war still lingers. Here you're attacked by crazed lepers, variety of bandits and the dwindling forces of the Golden Army. Dudes decked out in fancy armor and weaponry who were sworn to protect the city and are now just really a testament to its collapse. What's kinda cool too is that a lot of the time you'll see these different factions fighting amongst one another, which is always entertaining to watch. I mean, if there's one thing that games need more of, it's infighting. The goal here is to activate 3 towers to unlock a portal in the center of the city, which is easier said than done, believe me. This whole world is brought to life on the Unity engine, and generally things look pretty good. It's an odd mix of fantasy and science fiction with highly stylized enemy designs and a really awesome heavy metal soundtrack that just makes for some unique presentation. What's also good about all of this is that aside from the initial loading screen when the game begins, or that transition from the catacombs to the city, there's no loading screen whatsoever. You can move around both of these environments seamlessly and undisturbed. Well, I mean undisturbed aside from being attacked by every other living thing. But the world itself is presented to you on a blood-stained silver platter, and you're free to go about it however you wish. There's no objective markers, there's no map screen, just a flowing, expansive game world for you to discover at your own speed, and it's kind of awesome. It almost kind of gave me a bit of a watered down Hexen vibe in that sense, in that I'd pick up a key or some kind of quest item, and then the game would often let me figure out what I had to do with it myself. It's just that this time I actually had some kind of inkling as to what I was actually supposed to do with it. Speaking of influences and vibes, Elderborn is one of these many games released in recent years describing itself as Souls-like. I mean, it was either going to be that or Metroidvania. Souls-like has become a bit of a broad term these days, and I know it's a rough generalization that makes the fanboys seethe, but it is pretty spot on if you just want to dumb it down to some basic gameplay factors. Things like a challenging difficulty, leveling up, and large maps with environmental storytelling. So yes, off the back of that, Elderborn is Souls-like. With the combat, there's a high focus on learning enemy attack patterns along with blocking, parrying, and dodging. Damage from enemy attacks is high, and you've got a vial to restore your health points, which is pretty similar to the Estus flasks in the Souls games. Not to mention, you've even got a very tough final boss fight against a couple of guys that seems a lot like the fight against Ornstein and Smaug. But it works these elements into its own universe pretty well without feeling ham-fisted or lazily thrown in. Instead of resting at campfires to restore your health, it's fountains of water. And again, like Dark Souls' many campfires, they serve as respawn points, with the downside of respawning every enemy in the area. Instead of dropping souls when enemies are killed, they'll instead drop essence, which you'll then spend on either increasing your damage, your speed, or your health points. The more you spend essence on each of these trees, you can unlock extra skills too, like a charging attack where you kick into a bunch of enemies at once. Or being able to leap into the air and then stomp into the ground. You can even get an upgrade that allows you to pull off someone's head and throw it, suitably called Rip and Tear. Or even something simple like essence dropped by enemies automatically magnetizing towards you for an easy pickup. I think it's almost impossible to unlock all of these on a first time playthrough, I don't know, unless you really spend a hell of a lot of time grinding them out, so thank God the New Game Plus mode exists. And if you are killed, whatever essence you had on you is dropped wherever you were downed, and hopefully you're able to make it back to where you lost it to reclaim it. About the only complaint I have here is that I think it's kinda horrible how you have to hold down the interact button to pick this essence back up. I mean, trying to do that when you've got enemies still attacking you is complete suicide. You may as well paint a bullseye across your goddamn butt cheeks. Also, like all good first-person melee combat games, there's a kick button. And this kick is kinda like the roided up spiritual successor to the kick from Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. Press that F button and you can easily kick someone to their death off a ledge or a high platform, and it never gets old. The game's even nice enough to leave their essence on the same ledge they fell from for easy collection. Outside of all of that though, Elderborn's primary focus is on its melee combat, and that's something that it does offensively well. I mean, I was offended by how good it is. The most basic comparison I could make here is that the combat kind of feels like a more advanced version of that in Condemned Criminal Origins. You've got a standard and a heavy attack, a block and a parry, but most of it breaks down to timing parries and then getting in a quick counterattack. All up, there's 11 weapons. You've got a few different kinds of swords, both one and two-handed. There's a couple of maces, two kinds of spears, and then faster weapons like the sickles and the katars. You'll get these as you progress through the game, while some of them even being a little bit off the beaten path and could easily be missed by people who don't take the time to explore the environment. There's challenges for each weapon type, which earns you bonus essence, but aside from that, just getting a certain amount of kills with a weapon is going to master it, giving it a damage bonus as well. If you really break down how they all work, you've either got one or two-handed weapons, fast or slow, and then whether or not they can block or parry. Two-handed weapons like the sword and hammers are all used for blocking, along with being obscenely large and taking up half the goddamn screen. Like this thing here, a so-called golden cleaver that looks like something that Pyramid Head would use. Blocking is about as easy as holding down the right mouse button, which is going to block all damage taken from the front, but it's really second fiddle to parrying, which is what the spears, sickles, and the katana are used for. And this is where the combat starts to really open up, because parry windows for each enemy is completely different. Not to mention, enemies often have at least 2 different attacks, the timing for both of which again is obviously different. Then on top of that, not all parries are created equal. For some weapons it seems you've got to be more precise with the timing. Weapons like the sickles and the katana for instance, whereas that lenience for a weapon like the spear is a lot higher. And then, aside from all of that shit, consider you're often getting attacked by 2 or 3 completely different enemy types. And some of them even have unblockable attacks, and now you'll start to see how hectic things can get. Yeah, let's not mince words here, this game is often hard as balls, but there's also kind of something appealing about that. Overcoming a hard section of the game or effortlessly carving your way through a group of bad guys who could all single-handedly end your existence is pretty fulfilling. Kind of reminds me a bit of Doom Eternal, in that sense where everything is going your way, it's almost like you make the game look too easy, but all it really takes is 1 or 2 wrong moves and then it all comes crumbling down. After a perfect parry, you got a couple of seconds to pull off a counterattack, which does massive damage, along with slowing down the game speed, and there's something undeniably enjoyable about seeing an enemy's head leaving their torso in slow motion when you deliver that killing blow. It makes for a really challenging but ultimately enjoyable and rewarding gameplay loop. And by the end of the game, enemies that I'd once struggled to fight against, even one-on-one, became relatively easy to take out. You really do fall into this rhythm of knowing the right time to strike and the right time to hold off and fall back, and I guess that's a bit of a testament in the end to how well the game communicates its mechanics. I think the best games are the one that kick your ass initially, but then let you become the ass kicker, and that's something that Elderborn certainly pulls off. It ain't all perfect though, and this game has some dog shit sequences where I think the level designer just kinda forgot to take their brain pills or something that day. Most of these are pretty minor, but the main one I think being these 3 towers you've got to scale in the second act, which requires navigating up these narrow walkways to reach the top, and this sucks mostly because these walkways aren't very wide, so you can't really dodge left or right, only forwards or backwards. Just means you're ultimately forced into fighting enemies face to face, which, I mean look, that sounds fine, but some of these enemies have unblockable attacks. And when you're stuck with only being able to move forwards or backwards, that doesn't give you a lot of options to avoid taking a hit. Honestly, these sections are just kind of terrible, and I think the least fun parts of the game. And what's not helping is that you have to do this 3 times to finish the second act. Just kind of like a spaghetti sauce stain on what's otherwise a pretty damn fun and solid campaign. The ranged enemies though are easily the most annoying things in the entire game, and I have no idea why every single melee focused first person game like this always has to have some kind of asshole that just hangs back and throws crap at you from a distance. In Elderborn you've got these guys with spears, and then later on there's enemies that launch fireballs, and then these guys who kinda look like they're shooting a Nerf gun. You can eventually at least unlock the ability to deflect these back at the nearest enemy, but it doesn't make them any less annoying. And you know what, all of this stuff would probably deter me if only the core gameplay loop wasn't so much damn fun. Getting through the campaign for the first time took me about 7 or 8 hours, but even then there's a fair bit of replayability here. If nothing else, you'll at least want to have another go at a New Game Plus run, which scales the enemies to still be challenging, along with adding in the conduits, which are like tougher variants of the normal enemies who glow brightly and drop more essence. After that, there's even a New Game Plus mode, which increases the amount of conduits you encounter. You gotta say too, these conduits really mean business. They're able to kill you in a single hit, and they're randomly placed amongst the normal enemies, so a fair bit of RNG is involved in this too. Then there's a whole bunch of achievements as well, but I gotta say that some of these are just fucking sadistic. Like killing every single enemy in the entire game without dying once. Beating the entire game without dying, or even just beating the first act without upgrading. Like, damn. These are just kind of a bit hardcore for my taste, but if you want to give it a go for that anonymous gamer cred, well, then be my guest. Elderborn is solid proof that community feedback and dedicated developers can turn a troubled game around for the better. It went from being a game I could barely be bothered to spend time in to one that I lost track of time in. First-person melee games really aren't all that common, and the good ones are even less so. It's got a unique setting and a cartoonishly violent vibe that's instantly appealing, and it ticks all the boxes you'd want to see in an experience like this. Not to mention, I think it's properly priced too, coming in at a measly $21. For a game that lets you play as a badass warrior maiden and separate heads from torsos, along with stomping on undead warriors with the backdrop of a city that sounds like a your mama joke, that's money well spent.